Hi, in this video we'll go over the basics of coding style. So why are we talking about coding style? Well, it is all about readability, or how readable our code is. Now, readable kind of means how pretty our code looks, and obviously by that I don't mean, the color of the code or the shape of the code, but it is important that at a glance we have an idea of what the structure of the code is like. I understand we're still at the beginning. This might not make a whole lot of sense right now, but readability is something that I will emphasize. I will repeatedly come back to as we write more and more complicated code, and I promise you that when the code get complicated, and they will pretty quickly, that this will make a whole lot more sense. But for now, I just ask you to kind of just trust me that readability of code is important. Now, the good thing about Python as far as coding style or readability is concerned is that Python, the language itself, actually forces you to use good style without making it particularly tough, So, and that's actually a whole lot better than languages that are like C++ or Java, for those of you who are familiar with them. So I am going to give you a quick example of what I mean by that. Now, this is Java code. This is for a tic-tac-toe game, actually. So now, you probably don't understand it, which is fine. But, I mean, if you look at this code, it looks like there is some sort of structure to it, right? There are blocks of code that are indented. And for things that are indented, they are actually aligned, right? Things line up. So it looks kind of pretty. It looks like there is a structure to it. Same thing for Python tic-tac-toe player. In this case, it's also kind of things are consistently indented, things are kind of lined up. There's a clear structure to it. Okay. Now, the problem with code like Java is that you can easily make it very not pretty, like this, and maybe the IDE doesn't even let me to do that. But you can do something like this to make it really not pretty. I think you can destroy the indentation completely and do really odd things to it. And guess what? Java doesn't care, because Java ignores all the white spaces in the source file. So you can kind of mangle the the code kind of beyond recognition, and it will still run fine. Okay, I'm not going to actually run it, but I can. I just want to prove to you that all the bad things that I did just now, I still can run the program. Okay, now if you try to do the same thing with Python, though, if you're trying to make things misalign things, let's say, and immediately you see there's a red wiggly underline here. It's telling you, hey, there's something that's not quite right. If I just do something else to make it look bad, well, not only it looks bad, Python actually is not going to run the code. So if I try to run this, it's going to all sorts of weird syntax error. So that's what I mean by Python kind of partially enforce good style. And that is a really good thing as far as readability is concerned. Now, most modern IDE allows you to configure your coding style to your heart's content. But the good thing is, if you're using PyCharm, there's really nothing to configure, because most of its default settings are good enough. So hopefully all of us are using PyCharm. So exactly what does coding style dictate? Well, it tells us how, sort of the style in which we want to write the code and we want to format the code. So that includes, as we just saw, all the white spaces. They are actually quite important for readability. So coding style will tell us how the white spaces are used, how, for example, lines of codes are indented, how they should line up, and further things like variables and functions and classes, names. We'll learn them in down the road. The coding style will tell us how to name them, and it includes many other things, and we'll learn as we go along. Now, different groups or communities of programmers, like in a different company or even within the same between different teams within the same company, they might actually follow different coding styles. You know, it's a very diverse group, and programmers are very strong-minded people. So you might run into different styles. The good thing is, at least as far as Python is concerned, there is actually a fairly universally, well, not quite universally, but fairly accepted style guide that most of the Python programmers do follow. It is called PEP 8. PEP, I think it stands for Python Enhancement Proposal. There are many PEPs. We're going to be looking at PEP 8 a whole lot because, again, it tells us the coding style that we're going to use in this class. There are other PEPs that I will bring up in the future. Now, so we'll follow PEP 8, and right now we'll go over some of the basic and the important rules specified in PEP 8. Now, some of them might not make immediate sense just because we haven't written a whole lot of code yet. So if they don't make sense right away, it's okay. But maybe down the road in the next week or the week after that, when we learn something new, come back to this video and review some of the things we talk about here. So first, let's talk about white spaces. And we just saw, again, that white spaces are important to making our code pretty or readable. Now, they do matter in many cases in Python, not in all the cases. So one of the first example I want to show here is that if you know these statements, they're considered kind of on the same level, right? So there's no reason to kind of misalign them like that. And as a matter of fact, Python doesn't allow you to do that. Okay. So don't misalign things for no good reason. And that's one of the first things that Python code is readable, because it actually enforces indentation and alignment of code and their consistencies. Now, aside from the leading white spaces, there are other white spaces like, you know, white spaces inside parentheses. Those white spaces do not matter, and we can still run the code if we do that. But you know, there's really no reason to put these spaces here, so I would advise you not to do it unless there are good reasons. Now, when we get to doing math, and in math we use a lot of these binary operators where it has two operands on either side of the operator. Well, in those cases, it's good to have a space around, or two spaces, I guess, around the binary operator, one on each side, to separate it from the operands. So don't crunch everything together like that. Not good. Put a space. There are other types of white spaces, such as indentation. When we get to the conditionals and loops, when we talk about blocks of code, we'll talk about those at towards the end of this video. For now, let's talk about blank lines, not just white spaces. Blank lines. Now, blank lines don't matter to Python for the most part, so we do want to use them kind of strategically to group all the related statements together, such as in this example that I had. You know, if I have two prints that both are talking about, you know, one thing, then I don't put a space, I don't put a blank line between them. And then for another three prints, that talk about yet another things, then I don't put space between them, but between these two things I put one space to kind of give me a visual break between these two groups of related things. Now, do not use too many blank lines though. One blank line is enough. Two is in most cases going to be the most you're ever going to use. But if you put like that many blank lines, then there is, in most cases, there's no reason to do that, and it really kind of make your code looks unnecessarily long and just kind of ugly. Now, one thing I learned only recently that I never knew that I could do in Python is that you can actually put two statements of Python code on the same line if you use a semicolon at the end of the first statement, and you probably can put more than two on the same line. But yeah, this for those of you who know C++ or Java, this is how we signify the end of one statement with a semicolon. But even though Python allows you to do that, and I really have no idea why they even bother to support it, but it does. But don't ever put two statements on one line. If there are two statements, put them on two lines. So I don't want to ever see semicolons in Python because it's not Pythonic and it is not readable. And I want to say a few things about the length of a line. So as you can see in the screenshot here, and as a matter of fact here in the code, that if the line is too long, then I cannot see what's on the entire line without scrolling kind of horizontally. And if I have many lines that are long and I have to scroll, left and right all the time to try to read that line, then it becomes very, very inefficient. So we do everything that we can to kind of avoid having to scroll left and right horizontally. So now that does bring up the question, then what is the correct line length? Now, what PyCharm recommends is that every line you have at most 79 characters. That's kind of an odd number, and I think that probably comes from maybe in the old days a printer prints exactly 80 characters per line on a piece of paper, or maybe a monitor that displays 80 characters per line. Maybe it comes from that. But in any case, its recommendation at first glance, 79 characters per line, it seemed to be a little restrictive, right? Especially nowadays, we have, big giant 24, 27, 30 plus inch monitors. They're high resolution, so we can really see many characters on a single line. So, well, I mean, in here, I'm in the presentation mode. So even if I exit my presentation mode, even at this very low resolution of 720p, I can see way more than 80 characters a line, right? So why 79? Well, before I answer that, actually, because the slide actually points out a few things in this screenshot, so I think it's worth pointing them out here. First one is there is a line number here on the left margin, so I'm at line 25, and also at the bottom here there is also the line number as well as the column number of where my cursor currently is. So if you kind of keep your eye on this number here, if I move the cursor to the right, the column number increases, and if I go up, the line number goes down. If I go down on the cursor, then the line number increases. And finally, you do see this kind of a thin line that Python displays by default. I'm sorry, not Python. PyCharm displays on the left on the right side of the screen, and that's actually where the character or column number 120 is. So if I keep typing a little more, right up here I'm at 120. Here is 120, and the cursor is the next character is going to be 121. That's why it shows 121. Okay, so in a way, PyCharm actually kind of give you a hint of, okay, if your line get to 120 characters, it puts a line there. So let's go back to our original question. Why 79 or 80 characters as recommended by PEP 8? The reason for that is if we want to open multiple files side by side. So I can actually split the window into two windows, and then as you can see, each of the windows then get half of the width of the screen. Then yeah, in that case we don't have a whole lot of horizontal space, and it is mainly, I believe, for that reason that PEP 8 actually just recommend your code is limited to 79 characters per line. Now, I understand that we are not going to be working with many files. So, you know, splitting screen into two windows, two editor windows, that's really only useful when you're working on very large projects with many files. So since we're not going to do that for a very long time, then it is okay by me that if you have up to 120 characters per line in your Python source file, but don't ever exceed 120. Okay, that's not good. Now, my recommendation is actually that we do follow PEP 8. So if we can, you know, limit all of your lines to have at most 79 characters. It's good to get into a habit of doing that. Now, there are going to be times that you might have a long statement that are really, if you try to jam everything in onto a single line, it might exceed 120 characters or 79 characters. Well, so what can you do in that case to break a single statement into multiple lines? Well, you can actually do that, and very easily, and PyCharm's going to actually do that for you. Now I'm going to pretend this line gets very long, and I'm going to try to break it into two. So I position I'm going to break it into two lines after the number 3 here. So I position the cursor after 3, and I'm just going to press enter here. And you can kind of see magically PyCharm, at least, it would break it into 2 lines for us. The interesting thing to see here is it actually needs a little slash at the end to tell the Python interpreter that, hey, this is not the end of the line. This is not the end of the statement. The statement continues in the next line. So that's what this slash is for. It's technically it escapes the new line character, so that Python interpreter, the line continues. So that's one way to break a statement into multiple lines by inserting a slash at the end. But a better way to do this is actually, well, as you can see, when I remove that slash, it's not happy. The better way, though, is to actually put things in parentheses. I think that's the recommended way by PEP 8. And so if you do that, then you don't need that funny slash at the end if you put things into parentheses. So that's what I would recommend you're doing if you have to break things into multiple lines. Another thing to note here is that this binary operator, you see that I actually, I can either put this at the end of the line, right, +4, or at the beginning of the next line. And the style recommended by PEP8 is that you actually put that binary operator at the beginning of the next line. And you can read about its justification in the link that I put in here. Alright, I'm going to also talk about the indented block of code here. This will only make sense when we get to use study loops or conditionals, when we actually will use the indented block of code. So if it doesn't make sense now, skip it, come back later. Alright, so when we indent a block of code, like in an if statement, then the indentation, first, we must not use tab character to do the indentation here. Okay, don't ever use tab, but instead use 4 spaces here. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now in PyCharm you can use the tab character. You can use the tab key, and PyCharm automatically converts that tab key press into 4 spaces. So there's nothing that you need to worry about there. Okay, if you use PyCharm. Another thing I want to point out is if you look at many of my slides, the first indentation is actually 3 spaces. Now that's really a kind of a side effect that happens when I copy and paste code into Google Slides. I don't know why it happens, and for most of the time I don't have the time to fix it, and that's why there are 3 spaces. But in your actual Python code, use 4 spaces for 1 level of indentation, always. And if you have nested conditionals, nested loops, conditional nested inside loops, you have multiple levels of indentation, then each level of indentation should have its own 4 spaces. So this first level of indentation is 4 spaces, second level is 8 spaces, and so on and so forth. And finally, I want to point out that PyCharm is actually very helpful in telling you when you have a PEP8 violation. So for example, if I put lots of white spaces here, or the unnecessary white spaces here, you can immediately see there's a gray wiggly underline appear here, and when you move your mouse cursor over it, it says PEP8, multiple spaces before operator. So you should pay attention to that, read those messages very carefully. Most of the time they are right, but sometimes they could be overzealous, right? Another thing is, example is if I put lots of blank lines here, then you see this line is immediately underlined again, and it's telling you, hey, too many blank lines. So pay attention to these gray wiggly underlines. They are not syntax errors, but they are probably style warnings. And one very useful feature of PyCharm is that you can ask it to try to fix the style problems for you if you go to the code and then do a reformat code. So here I have too many white spaces and I have too many blank lines. So if I do a reformat here, it actually removes those spaces and extra blank lines for me. So like I said, most of the time it'll fix the errors for you. It doesn't fix everything. I think if your line is too long, like more than 79 or 120 characters, it won't fix that for you, at least not correctly. But this is still something worth doing once in a while so that your code is PEP8 compliant.